Hello again, this is Sam Medina, coming to you once again from One Accord Fellowship Church here in Lubbock. And for the last several weeks, we've been studying Psalm 26, one of those Psalms that apparently is not studied a lot. And when you first read it, obviously, it just seems like King David is griping, but he really isn't. He is trusting. He's trusting God. And at the very beginning, we said that this psalm is, perhaps if you have to give a title, it'd be How to Do Right When You've Been Done Wrong. And King David gives us a masterpiece. And not only about doing right, but how to react and what to do and what your practice is and how you live during that time. As you know, that when we've been done wrong, sometimes depending on the wrong, false accusation, lies, things that affect you and that you believe that other people believe. They believe lies about you. And it makes it difficult. It makes it difficult for most people to leave home or to go do some of the things that they used to do. And why is that? Well, because they have been wronged and they, instead of wanting to go argue with somebody or just have to explain that they've been wrong, they just rather keep away. But I don't think that's the best practice, especially if you know that you've not done anything wrong. We've learned in the previous 7 verses that of Psalm 26, we've learned in those previous 7 verses that King David has said, look, I'm going to leave it up to you, God. Please, you vindicate me. I'm going to be concerned more about my condition in front of you, that is my spiritual condition. Please examine me and check me out and see if I need to be confessing something. I've tried to walk in front of you, and I know that if I confess things to you that I'm going to be okay because your loving kindness is always before me. Then he goes on to say, and God, I'm not going to be listening to those who want me to get even. I'm not going to listen to those. I'm not going to listen to those voices. And today he brings up a point that I think if you've been done wrong, sometimes we have a tendency to just stay away from people. We've been done wrong, and you worry that people will believe those lies, and you're concerned, and it changes your normal way of doing things. Oftentimes people even quit going to church. They're concerned that people in the church might believe the lies that have been told about them, and they sometimes decide that they'd rather stay home. I think King David teaches us that we're not to cower at home, especially if you know you've not done anything wrong. And especially if you're trusting God. You see, God knows your heart. If God knows your heart and you can stand before God and say, God, I didn't do that. You know that it's a lie. Then you can stand with King David and say, God, you vindicate me. Yours is the vengeance, not mine. You're the one who handles everything, and you'll do it with perfect timing. You'll know when to do it. And I think King David in verse 8 teaches us that God's going to look at our heart, and when he looks at our heart, then there's nothing that should keep us from public worship. That is, you and I would say today, from going to the church, from going to the services, from going and worshiping God openly and publicly. And because in verses 6 and 7, he said, I'm going to wash my hands. I'm going to go about your altar. And then, Lord, once I do that, I'm going to worship you, and then I'm going to proclaim with my voice all the wondrous things you have done for me. And now in verse 8, he says, not only will I go to the altar, I will go and publicly worship you. Now, why is that? You see, King David had a pure and clean heart. In fact, he's been called the man after God's own heart. And it's amazing because at the very time when King David comes onto the scene as in biblical history, he's a young man of about 16 or 17 years old. And already God had looked into his heart. God had already seen what was going on. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, 1 Samuel 16, we're going to discover there that King David had said, well, he wasn't King David then, he was just David. And his father's name was Jesse. God had gone to the prophet Samuel and it said, Samuel, Saul will no longer be king. He had done some things that perhaps in a future study we'll get into, but it displeased God. And God said he will no longer be king. He says, I want you to go to Jesse and you will anoint one of his sons. Well, he had several sons, and the oldest one comes before him. And we find here in 1 Samuel chapter 16, the following says, so it was when they came, talking about the Jesse's children, Jesse's sons, when they came, that he looked at Eliab, that was the oldest one, tall, big, handsome, Eliab, and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before me. Samuel looks and says, wow, this is the guy. Look at what he looks like. He's the oldest, he's tall, he's rugged, handsome. This guy looks like a king. But you know what God answered? In verse 7 says, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. Listen to this. Okay? For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. You see, we can't fool God. God knows what's inside of us. He knows that when we go to him and say, God, vindicate me, you know that they've lied about me. You know that they've cheated me. You know that what they're doing to me is wrong. Whatever the case may be, God looks at your heart. That's why I said earlier, King David would go to God and say, examine my heart, examine me. And if there's something there that I need to confess, I'll gladly confess it, Father. I want to be pure and clean before you. I want to have, I will wash my hands, he says in verse 6, he says, I want to be of clean heart when I go before your altar and before I pray and before I tell people about how wonderful you are and what you've done for me. And here, this is the beginning of David. He is about, all the other brothers are going to come in front of Samuel, and God's going to go, no, 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 no. And then in fact, David's not even on the scene here. All the brothers are there, and God has said no to each one of them until Samuel, the prophet, asks Jesse, the father of all these boys, do you have any other sons? And he says, yeah, I do, but I've got a young one, and he's out there tending the sheep. You see, even his father didn't consider him king material. Even the father thought, well, that could never be it. How can you anoint a 16-year-old boy who is a shepherd? These my sons are here, and they served Saul in the military, and they're soldiers, and they know what they're doing. But David, the little shepherd boy that I have, he didn't even invite him. And yet when Samuel says, David, bring him before me. And as soon as Samuel sees him, God says, he's the one. Now why? It wasn't because at that point, it says he was a very handsome young man. And he was rugged in the sense that he was not weak. He was courageous to be out there and fight off all the animals that would try to destroy the sheep. But you see, he had everything. He knew how to shepherd the sheep, how to protect them. He would have to know how to help the people, how to protect them, how he was going to take care of the nation of Israel. And so when God says that's the one, what stands out clearly is that God looks at our heart. He looks at who we are. He looks at how we feel about him. And I really enjoy when I read back to Psalm 26, when I read verse 8, it says, it's an amazing verse, because it says, In verse 8 it says, Lord, I have loved the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells. Wow. He's saying, God, I've always liked being in church. God, I've always loved where your presence is. I've always loved where your glory dwells. Isn't that amazing? He's saying, God, no matter what I'm going through, there's something that trumps how I feel. I am not going to let lies keep me from publicly going to the place I've always loved being, the place where your glory dwells, to your house where you live, your habitation. I will be in your church, God, and I will praise you regardless of my circumstances. Perhaps you're going through some things and maybe you've quit going to church. Maybe nobody has visited you. Maybe you're feeling sorry for yourself. Let me tell you, it's not about somebody visiting you. It's about you visiting God. It's about you praising and worshiping God because he so rightly deserves it. You need to be there. You need to go and show up on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night, and it's like you saying to the rest of the world, I am voting in favor of public worship of my God. When you show up, it says a lot. I want to continue this verse, and then I want us to consider another verse that shows you exactly what King David was like and why God called him a man after his own heart, because of the love that King David had for being in God's house. If there's one thing that stood out in David's life, it was his love for the Lord, and his love for worshiping him, and his love for being in church. A lesson that perhaps, if you've not been in church lately, and if you've not been going, perhaps it's time. Perhaps it's time you did that. God bless you, and please join in with us next Wednesday, and we'll be studying, continuing with this verse, but we're going to put it together with a second verse in a different psalm, and you'll see exactly what David felt like. God bless you.